I'd arrived at the entrance of the cave that morning, having come prepared for the experience, or so I thought. I had the required 3 sources of light that you need for caving: a helmet, knee pads, extra clothing to keep me warm and dry. I'd been given a description of what to expect, encouraged to avoid side passages where I might get lost, and to keep my head down as I crawled through narrow spaces. I've been told that I'd been wading through knee-deep water several hundred feet in, and to look for a notch in the rock on the other side as I crossed. I was holding my pack overhead with water nearly up to my chest before I realised I was headed in the wrong direction. Having veered off to the right, I'd followed the wrong notch. This was my first unnerving mistake. With wet clothes, slippery shoes, and a steady underground temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit, I needed to find a campsite and to get into dry things. Eventually, I located a relatively flat place where I could lay out my pad and sleeping bag, and where water wasn't dripping continually from overhead. It was less than 1,000 feet in, but I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I would spend the night there alone in the dark. The cave goes back more than 3,000 feet, opening into larger rooms here and there. It continues in an underwater passage. Even beyond that, scuba divers are still exploring how far in it goes. The sound of moving water echoes down the corridors like distant voices. Stalactites in the shape of soda straws hang from the ceiling, now and then reaching down in long arms of wet rock, even folds of flowing drapery. Blind cavefish swim in the dark water, albino salamanders you can see right through, bats clinging to the roof. The complete absence of light was unsettling. Today we're thinking about caves.
Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the longest in the world, with 450 miles of mapped passages winding 5 levels deep into the earth.
And remember, John O'Groats is 874 miles from Land's End. That Mammoth Cave is almost as long as our country.
In southern France, there are cave paintings of horses and stags that are more than 17,000 years old. Gabbermung Cave in Australia's Northern Territory has paintings more than 35,000 years old.
There are so many caves in the Bible. Just a few examples. Elijah the prophet runs away from Jezebel, the queen, and hides in a cave. Moses hides in the cleft of a rock, a cave, so that he can see the hindquarters, the backside of God. So powerful is the presence of God. One writer actually says that you could read the Hebrew that Moses rides on the back of God. God playfully gives him a piggyback so that he sees the power and the presence of God without being consumed because of the holiness of God. And Jesus stands before a cave where Lazarus, his friend, has been killed, and Mary, not killed, he's died, and Mary and Martha are weeping, and Jesus says, "Come forth," and Lazarus comes out of the tomb and is unwrapped and is alive. Jesus' life begins and ends in caves. He's born in a stable, we're told in that nativity. Forget the snow and the robins and all of that in the background. It's more than likely that the stable was a cave carved out that the animals stayed in. That's Jesus' birthplace. No plush hospital or home birth for him. And when he dies, he's placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a cave that he'd carved out for himself but generously and graciously gave to Jesus. Jesus' life begins and ends in caves. At the cave I want to focus on today is a cave in which King David, who's not king yet, is hiding.
(1 Samuel 24 verses 1 to 22).
After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "Then Lord forbids that I should do such a thing for my master. The Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king!" When Saul looked back behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand too. Take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers came evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause, and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, Is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. You are more righteousness than I, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established to your hands. I now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
It's a rugged and fertile terrain which is made ideal for refuge, with an oasis and a freshwater spring west of the Dead Sea. I imagine the day was hot and the cave is cool. David and his men, a handful of men, are at the back of the cave, a deep cave, a damp cave, and they didn't know that Saul was in hot pursuit of them. Saul comes in from the blinding sun to answer nature's call, and his eyes struggle to adjust to the cool darkness. Have you ever looked in the sun and then tried to look somewhere else? It's so difficult, and he doesn't see the men. But in fact, he's not looking for them. He's wanting to answer nature's call. His belt and sword are on the floor as his cloak flutters around him. He is absolutely defenceless. But David forbids his men from killing and creeps along the side wall of the cave to cut a corner of the cloak off. He decides to do what is good in his eyes. The American pastor Eugene Peterson says, there are things that we can experience only in silence and solitude. And David in his cave time has come to understand that some things are good to do and some are not. In verse 4, where it says he cut off the corner of Saul's robe, this can be interpreted as a playful euphemism for cutting off something else men have that women don't. You get my drift. Robbing him of his manhood, making him helpless, emasculating the king of Israel. almost saying to him, "Look what I could have done to you, Saul, but I decided not to." David honours the less than perfect Saul, and Saul is convicted of his shortcomings. David's life is, to some degree, shaped in the cave. In the caves of our lives, we often encounter God and decide how we're going to live. Ignatius of Loyola was born in northern Spain to a family of the Basque nobility. The Basques remained fierce defenders of the land they held for thousands of years in the Western Pyrenees. Basque, they claim, was the language spoken by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The devil himself studied it for 7 years, but never learned more than 3 words. When Ignatius was a teenager, his father sent him to the royal court in Madrid, where he flourished as a promising young knight. His friends called him Inigo, and he was admired for his wit and reckless exuberance. He had an eye for the ladies and a readiness to fight at the drop of a hat. When the French invaded the nearby town of Pamplona in 1521, he sprang to the defence, rallying his men atop the walls. But his career as a warrior was ended when a cannonball shattered one of his legs. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. As he recovered from multiple surgeries, Ignatius read the lives of the saints and experienced a dramatic conversion. He envisioned himself becoming a soldier of Christ, beginning a valiant new quest by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But he only got as far as the town of Manresa near Barcelona. There his illusions were shattered. Everything fell apart and Inigo passed through a dark night of the soul. He stayed for almost a year, living in a cave for several months. There he started to write his spiritual exercises. From the mouth of his limestone cave near the river Cardona, he could look back on the sawtoothed ridge of Montserrat 10 miles away. That's where he'd stopped on his way there, leaving his sword and dagger behind, praying all night before the Mary altar in the Benedictine Abbey on the mountain slopes. He envisioned himself doing great things for God, but in the Manresa, the harsh, symbolic realities of the mountain, river and cave came together for him. He'd always aspired to the mountain heights, striving to be the best and most impressive knight at court, the bravest soldier, and now the best of all the saints. Suddenly the grandiosity of his life, his immense capacity for self-deception, became painfully apparent. It forced him down the mountain and into the cave, facing the work of carving out the canyon of his inner life. It proved the hardest time of his life, undercutting the bedrock of everything he'd known. For the first time he found himself alone, without an admiring audience, with no one to impress by his reputation. The once proud soldier fell into a dark depression over the hollowness of what his life had been and uncertainty as to what was coming next. The elegant courtier let his hair and fingernails grow. He begged for food in the streets and went day after day without eating. Swallowed up by a sense of desolation, he feared God could never forgive him for his sins. He was tempted to commit suicide, to throw himself into a crevice in the depths of the cave. But then came a breakthrough. The 30-year-old cavalier had always been a man given to his senses. Beautiful women, fine clothes, the taste of good wine, the thrill of hand-to-hand fighting. He now sensed God speaking to him through the surrounding landscape. He received a vision that he later described as the single most powerful experience of his life. It came as he sat by the river outside the cave. He was suddenly aware of being surrounded by beauty. The eyes of his understanding began to open. Inigo perceived the whole of creation in a new light, seeing God in all things, a central theme he developed through the rest of his life. He noticed multiple layers of wonder that he traced through the natural world, revealing God's sustaining love at every point. In the existence of bedrock elements like water and rock, in the flowering, animated life of plants, in the sensate feeling of which animals are capable, and finally in the sparkling intelligence of human beings. Each of these steps led him ultimately to an awareness of himself and everything else as a dwelling place for the divine majesty, suggesting the image and likeness of God. He also received a vision of Jesus, seeing the man of Nazareth in all of his humanity. The God he sought had to be anchored in this worldly sensory experience. in God become flesh. It wasn't abstract ideas about Jesus that persuaded him, but specific and earthy images of God alive in this world. He was drawn to Jerusalem so he could touch and see the actual places where the man had lived. This new captain now demanding his loyalty. The notion of contemplating Jesus in the physical places he'd occupied became a thread running throughout his book Exercises. A fearless new integrity emerged out of his cave experience in Manresa. A new courage based not on Basque machismo and romantic chivalry, but on Inigo's confidence that the world is filled with God's glory and that it dwelt in him as well. After returning to Jerusalem, he spent the better part of a dozen years getting an education. At first learning Latin with school children in Barcelona and ending by earning a master's degree at the University of Paris. In Paris he gathered the cadre of companions who became the first members of the Society of Jesus, founded in 1540. As General of the Order for the next 15 years, Ignatius dispatched Jesuit missionaries around the world, establishing schools and colleges, meeting the needs of the poor and adapting their vision of Christian faith to the cultures to which they came. Barbara Brown-Taylor talks about spiritual direction, and she says, "We go to counsellors when we want help getting out of caves. We go to directors, spiritual directors, when we are ready to be led further in." You may know of Johnny Cash. He came to a real crisis point in his life and he went to the Navajak cave in 1967 because he decided that he was going to commit suicide. But in that, filled with drugs, he had a profound spiritual experience and all of a sudden thought, oh my life, I don't want to die in a cave, I need to get out of here, there's a God and this God loves me. And he came out and his life from that cave experience, that deep, dark, dank place, was absolutely transformed, and he was free of his addictions from that point on, transformed by life in a cave. Joseph Campbell said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." Maybe that's true. Maybe we need to go deeper sometimes into those caves with experienced spiritual directors, people that we trust, so that God can bring life for us, just as he did for Ignatius, just as he did for King David. 100 people in a dimly lit ballroom close their eyes and wander around. This is an experiment by psychologist Jean Houston. When they bump into someone, they ask softly, "Are you God in hiding?" That person responds asking the same question, "Are you God in hiding?" They then move on to someone else and the question is asked over and over. Jean assigns someone the role of God in advance. When someone wanders into that person and asks the question, "Are you God in hiding?" they are greeted with silence and become God as well, now remaining silent when others question you. Gradually, stillness spreads across the room. Within a few minutes, 100 people enter into complete silence in awe of the fact that God is there in every one of them. God is in the darkest, silentest caves. God is present with us.
In 1829, the German composer Felix Mendelssohn made a visit to Fingal's Cave on the island of Staff of Scotland, western coast. It's one of the largest sea caves in the world, cut by ocean waves out of the black lava pillars rising from the earth. The cavern is a huge cathedral cut into stone. Mendelssohn wasn't simply overwhelmed by the haunting beauty of the place. He heard it singing to him. He sent a postcard back home to his sister, scribbling the opening notes of the Herb's overture that came into his head there. The idea of Jules Verne's novel Journey to the Centre of the Earth also came to him in that cave, as did some of the J.M.W. Turner's best impressionist paintings. The single cave had been extraordinarily productive in all kinds of artistic creations. Belden Sea Lane.
Caves, cold, dark, imposing places, but also places of potential transformation. Definitely, I think, for King David, in the way he lived his life and was shaped to be a king in his encounter with Saul. Certainly for Ignatius of Loyola, who made so many transforming things in the world, and for Johnny Cash, a washed-up pop star who continued to live a life and release much great music afterwards. Caves can be a place of transformation. How about for you and me? Can God transform us in those deep, dark places that are forbidding and foreboding? I believe he can.